007 GoldenEye is frequently cited as one of the most important games in history. It played a large role in popularizing first-person shooters, and it changed the face of gaming forever. Before 1997, FPS games like Doom had already shown the potential of fast-paced shooters, but GoldenEye was able to bring that same joy to console owners. With a beloved campaign and revolutionary multiplayer, it paved the way for later franchises like Call of Duty and Battlefield that still draw in millions of players until this very day. GoldenEye isn't the only 007 game though. The history of Bond in gaming dates back to the 1980s, and looking into the progression of the franchise over time helps answer the pressing question: what happened to 007 games? During the 1980s, a grand total of 6 Bond games were produced. The first was simply called James Bond 007, and was released on various consoles like the Atari 2600 and Commodore 64 in 1983. It was a side-scroller that let you control Bond across 4 different levels inspired by various films like Diamonds Are Forever and The Spy Who Loved Me. You were given a multi-purpose vehicle to do cool Bond stuff like shoot guns and use flare bombs against your enemies as you played from left to right. There isn't a lot else to say about the title. It received mixed reviews and its legacy isn't anything to write home about, but hey, you have to start somewhere. All of the 007 games during the 80s, including A View to a Kill, Goldfinger, The Living Daylights, Live and Let Die, and License to Kill, were all published by Domark, a British publishing group that became Eidos Interactive in 1995, which was bought by Square Enix in 2009. Most of the Domark games were unremarkable because they saw enough commercial success that the publisher wanted to continue making the games. By the end of the decade, the Bond games were better but still far from being good. License to Kill, released in 1989, is a good example of where the franchise was by the end of the 80s. Computer Gaming World only recommended 007 License to Kill strictly for the action-oriented player, with others likely finding it a license to bore. Ace Magazine considered it fun while it lasts, but once you've cracked it, you won't bother to come back. The Games Machine was actually more positive though, saying that the game was designed on a grand scale, and that it followed the film quite well, albeit with scenes simplified to shoot 'em up and dodge games. Bond games of the 1980s didn't do a fantastic job of impressing fans or critics, and they didn't create much of a legacy. With the exception of James Bond Jr. and James Bond 007 The Duel, there weren't any more Bond games made until development of GoldenEye started during the mid-90s. The game was developed by Rare and directed by Martin Hollis, who had previously worked as a second programmer on the coin-op version of a game called Killer Instinct. He and Rare discussed the possibility of developing a game based on a future Bond film in 1994, and after the GoldenEye movie was released in 95, Hollis told Rare that he was interested in doing it. Rare's 1994 title, Donkey Kong Country, had been a huge success, and the team wanted to make a 007 2D side-scroller, but Hollis wisely refused. Instead, he wanted to make a 3D shooting game for the upcoming Nintendo 64 console that was still in development at the time. He drafted all of his design ideas that he wanted in the game, including gadgets, weapons, characters to use, story digressions, and artificial intelligence that would react to the player's actions. Many of those mechanics made it into the final version of the game. Once work on the game started, Hollis incorporated much of what he had seen working in Virtua Cop and from Doom into 007, and the results were fantastic. Fans and critics loved the game for its campaign and multiplayer modes, both of which were central to the first-person shooter's success and legacy. Overall, GoldenEye was the first Bond game to receive universal acclaim, and it set the stage for the yearly releases that followed for nearly a decade. Rare never made another Bond game before EA bought out the license in 1999. The first game to be released in the EA era of 007 was Tomorrow Never Dies, which departed from GoldenEye's first-person perspective and didn't include multiplayer, although a co-op mode was supposed to happen before it was cut during development. Tomorrow Never Dies was met with very mixed reviews. It received an average score of 62.44 at GameRankings, based on an aggregate of 28 different reviewers. Most people hated the change from first to third person and cited average gameplay, awkward controls, and a short story and a lack of multiplayer as reasons that it just didn't live up to the high standard that GoldenEye had set 2 years prior. EA didn't lose faith in Black Ops Entertainment as a developer though, and decided to stick with them for the next game in the series, The World Is Not Enough. The game used an improved version of the Tomorrow Never Dies engine and featured a return to the first-person perspective. Producer of the game, Joel Wade, explained that the first-person perspective would help immerse the player deeper into the game and make the gameplay experience more intense, but it still fell a bit short. It was an improvement over Tomorrow Never Dies, but it didn't feel as innovative or fun as GoldenEye. It was a short, shallow game that did very little to elevate the games to a new level. Twice in a row, EA pushed out a title that underwhelmed. They relied on the license and already established popularity of the franchise without putting an adequate team in charge of development. One particular quote from Shane Satterfield of GameSpot resonates particularly well with my experience with the game back in 2000. He said the game is not GoldenEye for the PlayStation, but if you're tired of playing through Medal of Honor or Metal Gear Solid, it does provide temporary relief for your stealth shooting addiction. As a diehard fan of the stealth genre, I think he hits the nail on the head pretty well. The game was decent, and it fit in pretty well with similar shooter games. However, it just wasn't special, and it left the community wanting more. Over the next several years, EA continued to push out Bond games, including Agent Under Fire, Nightfire, Everything or Nothing, and From Russia with Love. Agent Under Fire was released in 2001 for the Xbox and PlayStation 2, and it added driving missions as well as rail shooting mechanics. The game sold nearly 5 million copies, making it the second most successful game in the series, but again, it received very mixed reviews. In 2001, the PC version was cancelled, and that's why Agent Under Fire was even made in the first place. It was far from an improvement, and after its release, the 007 franchise was starting to feel like the same game every year, similar to the complaints that certain franchises built on yearly releases receive now. But in 2002, Nightfire was released. It was developed by Eurocom, a new publisher, for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox consoles, with a PC port that was done by Gearbox. It was positively received because of its realistic animation and graphics, but some critics thought that the game was too short, while others noted that Nightfire did nothing to attempt to improve over previous 007 games, especially GoldenEye. So, 5 years after GoldenEye's release, fans and critics were still looking at Bond games and saying they weren't as good. That response pretty much sums up the direction that the franchise was headed over those years. Over time, different publishers bought the rights to the license, but they never put any heart or effort into making the actual games better. In 2004, EA released Everything or Nothing, which did mostly the same thing as Nightfire but just added more driving. That same year, GoldenEye, Rogue Agent, was also released. The game was a first-person shooter, but it was only vaguely related to the Bond franchise, and really didn't have anything to do with the original GoldenEye, which is the main reason that it was hated by the people that played it. Basically, it was a spin-off that didn't fit in with the other games or do anything to improve gameplay. Another spin-off, 007 Racing, was released during the EA years as well, but I'm not going to dive heavily into it because it's more of an outlier than a true addition to the series. In 2005, EA released From Russia with Love, yet another third-person shooter in the same style as its predecessors. And again, it received mixed reviews. The EA saga of 007 was characterized by the same things: third person, lack of innovation, and middling reception. 2005 was the last year that EA would release a Bond game because 2006's Casino Royale was cancelled, because it wasn't going to be ready by the film's release in November. This made MGM lose millions of dollars in licensing fees, and EA, by this time, wanted to move away from movie franchise games and pursue other games that were based more on original intellectual properties. EA officially left Bond forever in May of 2006, leaving behind a string of mediocre yearly releases that capitalized on popular licenses. It didn't take long for Activision to swoop in and pick up the 007 license and to begin producing their own Bond games the very next year. Their first game was to be Quantum of Solace, and they picked Treyarch of Call of Duty Black Ops fame to head the game's development. It was a time of hope for Bond fans, and for the first time in a long time, there was a possibility that we were going to get something new and refreshing instead of another low-effort EA title. In hindsight, it actually was an improvement over the EA years, which likely explains why the game was received well and sold enough to be profitable. However, it was too little, too late. The next 3 games were not actual additions to the franchise, in the sense that they were actually either reimaginings or spin-offs. GoldenEye 007, a kind of sort of remake of the original GoldenEye, was released in 2010. It was actually pretty good, and a lot of people enjoyed it even though it wasn't as revolutionary as its spiritual predecessor. The other two Activision games were Bloodstone and 007 Legends that was released in 2012. Neither were critically acclaimed and both of them sold poorly. It was the last time we ever received a James Bond game, and it begs the question, why did they stop making them? Well, that's complicated to answer, but there are a few reasons that can be discovered through deductive reasoning. The first reason is that AAA companies are no longer as interested in licensed games. They now prefer to create things based on new intellectual property, because it's more lucrative and provides dev teams with more freedom. EA has even gone so far as to say that licensed games are as dated as dinosaurs, and that the movie game business is no longer a viable option. Sounds kind of ridiculous in light of Spider-Man's recent success, but perhaps corporate bigwigs in the game industry don't see things the same way. After Activision dropped Bond like a hot rock in 2013, we have seen a significant decline in the number of licensed titles that they've produced, so they probably agree with EA. Another reason is that modern games are all about open-world gameplay. Game companies don't make linear stories anymore because they don't think people want that. It's difficult to make an open-world game based on existing intellectual property, apparently. We recently saw Call of Duty cut campaign modes, which is indicative of how Activision views single-player linear experiences, and likely explains part of the reason they gave up on 007. Multiplayer is also headed away from GoldenEye-type experiences that people raved about during the 90s, and perhaps the series doesn't offer as much in terms of revolutionizing game content in the way that AAAs want nowadays. 007 Battle Royale, anyone? That just doesn't feel right, and licensed properties don't fit well within the current state of gaming. I think the most obvious reason is money, though. As time passed, Bond games made less and less money. They did decently well during the EA years, but the rinse-repeat yearly releases left a sour taste in consumers' mouths that came to fruition during the Activision years when we saw sales numbers dip drastically. We all know that AAA companies don't pursue things that they don't think will be profitable, and given 007's track record, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to take a chance on developing a game that could become a serious financial liability. With all of that said, there's certainly hope for the future, and I wouldn't doubt that we see another Bond game someday. Telltale wanted to make one back in 2014, but it never happened, and now all hope for that is lost because, you know, bankruptcy and all that. Either way, we'll probably get another 007 game eventually, but I would be highly surprised if it is developed by a AAA company. I'd like to see what a smaller studio could do with the license, so hopefully we'll find out at some point in the future. What's your favorite Bond game though? Do you even think about the franchise anymore? Do you miss it? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to share it to every platform and person that you know. It's the only way we will ever grow here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.